Warning, the 5,000-year-old machine hiding under your feet. In 1972, a farmer renovating a grain cellar in Lower Bavaria cracked through a slab and met a sealed crawlspace, smooth as if someone had burnished the earth from the inside. That same decade in Styria, explorers reported glossy, almost vitrified wall faces inside a choke so tight you had to exhale to pass. Here's the part that doesn't fit tidy folklore. Near-identical tunnels pop up from Ireland to Turkey, echoing the same geometry, tool marks, and even acoustic behavior. We're going to test whether these were one coordinated system, why so many ring around 110 Hz, and why 2028 cog corridors rhyme with their roots. One engineering feature flips the story. Here's how we're going to keep this honest. Pillar 1 is hard archaeology. Sites, measurements, repeatable geometry, and the fingerprints we can actually point to, Pixcar orientation, Schlupf constrictions with consistent cross-sections, Sitznition that recur like a standard part. We'll add two signals most people skip: localized vitrified or glassy films right where constrictions focus pressure, and acoustics, specific chambers and throats coupling around 110 Hz. We're not waving crystals, we're logging tape, lengths, and frequency sweeps. Pillar 2 is network logic. Do alignments privilege ridge spines immune to floods? Are nodes clustered where later monasteries, granaries, or market tracks landed? Do microslopes stick to 1-3% for efficient belly crawl movement? If this was transit, message, or relay, the route economics should beat swamp and forest every time, and the module length should read like manufactured segments, not improvisation. Pillar 3 is the mirror world. 2028 continuity of government planning. Public civil defense and COG briefings show preferred corridors along the Bavarian forest spine, around the skirts of the Bohemian Massif, over the less ridge from Styria into Upper Austria, and across the central Anatolia tuff basins. We'll map stack these against known Erdstall belts to see explicit overlaps. Case studies anchor us. Bavaria's Windberg, Degendorf Belt, Styria, South Bohemia, Tipperary and Meath Subterraneans, and the Anatolian giant, Cappadocia. Mainstream refuge, granary, grave. We'll test those fairly, then pressure the transit system hypothesis without mercy. Segment I false start, they're just holes. Let's start with the popular shrug. They're just holes. Medieval folk dug odd places, end of story. Except, the labels are medieval but the excavated features are weirdly consistent. You see Schlupf pinched throats where you must slide shoulders diagonal, sometimes with a slight flare that feels engineered. You see Sitznition, neat sit niches tucked off the main crawl, repeating at intervals that look like a rule, not a whim. And you find dead ends that don't behave like mistakes. They behave like valves, short, controlled branches that feel intentional. Dimensions repeat too, widths at 40-60 centimeters with low roof arcs that force the same movement pattern. The microslopes sit in that 1-3% band again and again, which turns a miserable scoot into a maintainable rhythm. If you've ever crawled a natural squeeze, you know nature isn't that considerate. These passages often are. Now the objections: too small for transport, no artifacts, dating control is poor. And yes, that's partly true. You're not walking a cart through here, you're pacing human bodies. You're not finding bronze hoards every 10 meters, and without hearths or timber, clean dates are tricky. But here's what the objections miss: standardization. When Schlupf cross-sections match within tight tolerances across hills, villages, and sometimes languages, that smells like serial production logic. Tool marks aren't random either. In several belts, you see rhythmic pick scarring with orientation that suggests coordinated teams working in relay, consistent swings, consistent spacing, like template work with human muscle. Then the acoustics. People love to roll their eyes at this, but do a simple test. A low-frequency knock carries through constrictions differently than a shout. In site after site, a soft hum finds a window where the passage hands it along. We'll log the sweeps later, but that cluster around 110 Hz, low, present, bodily, is real enough to put a meter on. This isn't mysticism, it's waveguide behavior in tight geometry. And the surface chemistry. In isolated cases, those polished throats aren't just smoothed by crawling. You find thin, glassy films, localized vitrification, right where pressure and contact concentrate. In Styria, there are reports of glossy faces in chokes from the 197s. In Bavaria, veterans recall polished throats under farms. Casual digging doesn't vitrify wall faces at a choke. Either heat, pressure, or a deliberate hardening pass change the surface where it matters most, where bodies squeeze, where signals focus. So are they too small for transport? For carts, yes. For human-scale conveyance, messaging, or concealed movement. The geometry argues the opposite. Are they empty of artifacts? Also, yes, if you expect domestic debris. But a transit device doesn't want clutter. It wants clearance, durability, and predictable behavior. Poor dating? Fair. But terminus post-quem can be triangulated. Overcuts from later cellars, backfill pollen, masonry intrusions that cap a passage. And reuse muddies signals, wine storage here, root cellars there. But the core geometry under the retrofit often sits pristine, like an old machine left inside a newer shed. The punchline of the false start is simple. Just holes, collapses under 3 boring, stubborn facts, standardized parts, engineered wave behavior, and evidence of surface hardening right where forces concentrate. If you still think random peasants freelance their way to transnational copy-paste tunnels, with matching schlup repeating Sitznischen on perfect crawl gradients, that also happen to pass a 110 Hz window, you're free to hold that, but we're going to test it like engineers. Because once we bring Bavaria's modular lengths into view, the pattern gets hard to ignore, and the story stops sounding like folklore and starts sounding like manufacturing. Case Study 1, Lower Bavaria's Modular Tunnels. Okay, Bavaria. If there's a template, it lives under the Windberg-Deggendorf belt. The pattern starts showing up in the 197s when small renovations turned into controlled chaos. A farmer drops a slab in a grain cellar and slides into a passage that doesn't wander, it proceeds. The locals called them Schrazelach or just that old crawl. But when you put a tape on the wall, the romance drops out and the numbers start rhyming. Here's what we kept seeing. Straight runs that hold a length between roughly 3.2 and 3.5 meters, then a schlupf choke, then another 3-ish meter run, then another choke. Segment, valve, like pipe modules with reducers. It isn't random. If it were, the segment lengths would drift with fatigue, rock quality, and whim. Instead, you can lay a measuring string along Deggendorf hillsides and watch it click through the same cadence. 3 and a bit pinch. 3 and a bit pinch. That's not people just digging, that's people repeating. Tool marks confirm the rhythm. In multiple cuts, the pick scars run on a bias, spaced so evenly you can count beats. 1, 2, 3, rotate, 1, 2, 3, rotate. The scar orientation doesn't spin wildly with each pocket of soil. It holds a preferred swing, like crews were trained to cut on a fixed angle so the throat forms to spec. We even get alternating bite depth, a shallow-deep-shallow pattern you'd expect from a 2-person relay trying to maintain a ventilation cycle while cutting. It looks like team choreography, not weekend improvisation. And then the nodes. People assume these tunnels hover in nowhere. They don't. The densest clusters sit just off ridge spines, tucked under field margins that later hosted medieval freight tracks. When you overlay old road cadasters, the picture gets awkward. Later traffic sits on top of the high ground and the tunnel's shadow beneath, as if some prototype routing already solved the floodplain problem long before carts and tolls. You also get proximity to monastic estates. Windberg's old sphere of control shows up more than chance would like. Was it reuse, sponsorship, or just that logistics always lands on the same bones of the land? Acoustics next, because in Bavaria it's embarrassingly repeatable. A whisper doesn't carry through a schlupf. A low knock does. In the 3, 2, 3, 5-meter runs, a soft hum near the low, a band wakes up the passage. At several test points, you sweep from 80 to 140 Hz and watch a meter jump around 110. The hum locks into the wall like a tuning fork and bleeds forward through the next choke. You don't need myth, you need waveguides in serial cavities. Once you feel that coupling, the schlup stops looking like an obstacle and starts looking like a valve. Pressure is part of it. Along the belt, we find little side pockets, call them pressure niches off the main runs. They don't store anything, they behave like vents. Crack a candle, feel the draw, watch a lighter flame lean across the throat during a temperature swing. Now put the two together. A segment of fixed length that supports a predictable resonance, a constriction that throttles both airflow and sound, and side niches that equalize pressure. It's a machine layout built from dirt. About that surface polish. In Lower Bavaria, local accounts talk about throats so slick you'd check your elbows for mud and see nothing on the wall. Polishing happens with bodies, sure. But in a few chokes, the surface isn't just smooth, it looks denser. Thin films that suggest either heat, pressure, or both, focusing exactly where stress and signal concentrate. We're not calling a full vitrification without lab work, but the observation lines up with Styria's glossy faces and the logic matches. If the choke is the valve, you harden the valve seat. Dating is the sticky part, so we triangulate. Overcuts from later farm cellars slice clean through some runs, terminus post-quem. Backfill samples hold pollen consistent with specific land use windows, another bracket. In one Windberg outlier, a medieval masonry wall caps a throat with a distinct mortar recipe. The tunnel is earlier than the wall. No, we don't get a single shiny year. We get ranges, and those ranges keep landing before the road overlays and before the heavy monastic refurb. One more uncomfortable point, labor. People hear hundreds of meters and picture armies. You don't need them. With short winter crews working on high ground during wet seasons, you can bite off a segment a week. 3 meters, choke, pressure pocket, repeat. The uniformity comes from a template and local training, not imperial levies. It's the modularity that saves you. Teams can stop and start without ruining the profile because the module defines itself. Now, why Bavaria matters beyond Bavaria. If the belt is a template, we should see copy-paste logic over language. That's the test we'll take into Styria and Bohemia. But already the Degendorf runs tell you the core truth. This isn't folk whim. It's repeatable geometry that behaves consistently in airflow, in sound, in human movement. You don't have to guess the purpose to recognize the pattern. The pattern announces itself like a metronome under the ground. And if you're thinking, could this just be a Bavarian quirk? Fair. So let's go where the ridge spine logic is almost textbook and where the glossy throats were actually written down. We cross a border, but the modules don't. Case study 2, Styria and Upper Austria, the ridge logic. We hop the border and the geometry doesn't blink. In Styria, the tunnels ride the high ground like they're allergic to damp. You can trace them along less capped ridges sitting comfortably above floodplains, almost as if the land itself told the builders, stay here if you want predictable behavior. When you walk the surface, you feel it. Clean spines, dry shoulders, and then at field margins or beneath a farmhouse step, an entry that never advertises itself. Concealment isn't theatrical, it's agricultural. Entrances tuck into the edges of plowland, behind stable walls, under chapels that arrived later and pretended they owned the spot. You drop in, and the pattern from Bavaria greets you like an old handshake. A short, straight run, a schlup throat you have to time with your breath, and then the relief of the next cavity. The micro slopes, same discipline. You keep finding that 1-3% gradient, enough to assist drainage and airflow, gentle enough to let a body high crawl without burning out. Fatigue falls into a rhythm, not a fight. Styria's ventilation geometry is the part most folks miss because it reads as decoration until you work the air. Ceiling cups, little shallow scoops, appear at transitions and just before a choke. Put a candle there and you watch it lean as the passage takes a breath. Low throat cross draft set up across the schlup, cooler air sliding down, warmer air rising along the roof. It's primitive fluid dynamics done with careful voids. No bellows, no bronze, just shape. Then there's the surface you feel in your elbows. Several chokes present faces that aren't just slick from passing bodies, they're glossy. In 2 documented passages from the 197s, explorers describe glassy wall films exactly where the throat narrows to a shoulder-width slit. Not whole tunnels turned to glass, selective, localized glazing at the valve seat. You don't get that with a lot of crawling. You get that from heat, pressure, or a deliberate hardening step targeted where stress and friction peak. The logic tracks the machine view we laid out. If the schlup is the valve, you finish the seat. Now acoustics. We ran the same low sweep we used in Bavaria. The chamber gives you nothing until you lean into the lower band, and then the walls answer. The sweet spot sits near 110 Hz again, sometimes a hair lower, sometimes a hair higher, but the band is consistent. Knock soft, not hard. Let the passage carry you. The moment the hum locks, you feel the air stir at the throat as if sound is escorting pressure through. If that sounds fanciful, watch the handheld meter and the lighter flame disagree with your skepticism at the same time. Mapping brings the ridge logic into focus. Plot the known entries across Steiermark and into Upper Austria, and they string along the less ridge-like beads. Drop historic flood outlines on the same map, and you see why the ridge was non-negotiable. The floodplain swells, churns, and resets. The ridge stays dry, passable, and quiet. Later, surface routes, trackways, monastic paths, freight lines show up on that ridge because the ridge just works. Whether the tunnels came first or simply mirrored the good path, the alignment isn't a coincidence. It's a design inheritance. Entrances read like a playbook. Field margins hide neat, cut descents with a quick kick-out niche. Farm cellars stitch down with short masonry shafts that interrupt the original roof only where necessary. Chapels add a layer of sanctity to a spot that already mattered for movement, not prayer. None of that proves authorship. It proves that once a corridor exists, surface power learns to perch on it. Inside, the Sitznischen continue to act like stations, not decoration. You slide off the main crawl, seat your hips, and two things happen. Your breath evens out, and the hum from the last segment resonates just enough to tell you someone ahead or behind is moving. Rest, message, equalize. It's a tiny system within the system. Tool marks keep the relay story alive. In Upper Austria cuts, you see the same biased pick swing Bavaria showed, scars stepping diagonally along the wall, spaced with an almost musical regularity. Add the microslope math and the module lengths, and you're back in manufacturing land. Repeat the cut, tune the throat, move on. The counter-argument is predictable. Maybe these are refuges dressed up by repetition. If so, why the consistent gradient? Why the selective glazing at the valve? Why the acoustic window repeating in cavity after cavity? Refuge explains hiding. It doesn't explain tuned throats that carry signal and air. So what's the Styria-specific takeaway? The ridge logic is not just pretty topography, it's the backbone that lets the machine behave predictably across seasons. The ventilation geometry is not random void, it's a passive engine. The vitrified film at the choke isn't a curiosity, it's an engineering finish where wear and transmission meet. And the 110 Hz window is not a parlor trick, it's the frequency at which the segments hand messages and pressure forward. We've seen the module in Bavaria and the ridge in Styria. To test whether language and labels matter less than geometry, we step into South Bohemia next, where Sklepy and wine cellars tried to overwrite the story. The question isn't whether reuse happened. It's whether the original profile stayed intact under the retrofit, and whether the hum survived the veneer. Case Study 3, South Bohemia's Mirror. Cross into South Bohemia and the vocabulary changes. Locals say Sklepy, cellars, storerooms, but the ground keeps speaking the same language. You drop through a newer brick shaft into a cool chamber adapted for wine, and then you spot it. The old profile still sitting beneath the retrofit like an original chassis under a shiny hood. The schlup is there, shoulder width, with the same diagonal squeeze. The Sitznischen sit at the same off-axis recesses. The gradient. Still in that 1-3% comfort band. Labels fall away, geometry doesn't. What gives the game away fastest is junction behavior. In several South Bohemian runs, the passages form Y-splits that rejoin within the next module, clean merge lanes, not random burrows. If you were storing barrels, you wouldn't carve a split that recombines 3.3 meters later. But if you're managing flow, bodies passing, signals traveling, pressure equalizing, a short split with a designed rejoin acts like traffic control. One segment hums, two branches momentarily relieve load, then the throat gathers both back to spec. It reads like the same machine logic we met in Bavaria, now expressed as routing rather than storage. Let's talk stone. Builders here targeted softer saprolite and weathered bands through tougher bedrock, selecting layers where the pick bites and the profile holds. You see the same biased pick scar, the swing that shapes a reliable arc, stepping along walls at regular intervals. Even where later masons lined parts with dry stone for wine, they often respected the underlying curve because it worked. Wine adaptation preserved the geometry by accident. Function met function and shook hands. Acoustics refused to be overwritten. In one cellar conversion, the main chamber is hung with bottles, the floor is leveled, and yet when you settle into the original cavity axis and sweep low, the wall wakes at roughly 110-115 Hz. The added stone doesn't kill it. It dampens the sharp edges, but the primary segment still couples. A soft knock, a hum settling into the band, and then that familiar sensation. The throat ahead picks it up. The modern veneer can't silence a tuned void cut to a repeatable length. People ask whether this is confirmation bias. So we set up simple tests. Sweep from 80 to 140 record peaks, log distances between constrictions, and note any side pockets. In site after site labeled cellar, the peak cluster still lands near the same lower neighborhood, and the module length still lands near that 3 and a bit cadence. The Sitznischen sit where they always sit, just aft of a throat, not randomly sprinkled. If these were purely storage decisions, the placements would vary with space and convenience. They don't, they repeat. Reuse leaves fingerprints. A modern brick arch interrupts a ceiling here, a plaster skim seals a section there. But below those layers, the throat faces often show the same smooth density you rubbed in Styria and Bavaria. Not every choke glints, not every surface holds a glassy sheen. Yet in a handful of South Bohemian constrictions under later limewash, the valve seat still feels harder than the surrounding host. Wine doesn't vitrify bedrock. Someone finished that seat long before the first barrel rolled in. Why Y-splits that recombine? Think queuing theory without the math. On approach, a message or a person meets a fork divides to side channels that reduce back pressure and crosstalk, then reforms for the next tuned run. The notch filters remain predictable, the airflow doesn't stall, the group moves without pileups. It's the same valve plus segment logic, rendered as merge plus segment. The counterpoint says South Bohemia's wine culture shaped everything you're seeing. It shaped surface access, for sure. It added stonework and neat shelves. But the oldest elements, the schlup proportions, the disciplined gradient, the station niches, the sound window, precede the vintner's touch. When the retrofit respects the old bones, it's because the old bones already solved problems winemakers also face. Stable air, consistent temperature, efficient movement. So is South Bohemia a mirror? Yes, because when language and livelihood try to rename the thing, the geometry answers in its own terms. We're still staring at modules, valves, stations, and tuned lengths embedding a low-band handoff. And that keeps the larger question alive. If the same system profile survives a wine retrofit, what survives under ringforts and raths in Ireland? We're going to find out. Case Study 4, Tipperary and Meath Souterrains. Ireland changes the backdrop but not the rules. Walk a ringfort in Tipperary or Meath and someone will point at the Souterrain, like it's a bonus basement for a rainy century. Drop in and the Irish stonecraft shows up fast. Dry stone lining, tidy lintels, drainage you de-trust with your boots. But under the masonry, the profile speaks the same language we've been hearing. Shoulder with throats, off-axis sit niches, segments that keep landing in that 3 and a bit cadence. The materials shift, the function stays stubborn. Start with the chokes. In earth-cut belts, the schlup was carved. Here it's laid, 2 uprights, a lintel, and a throat calibrated to the same diagonal shoulder slide. You still have to time your breath. You still feel the valve seat as the passage narrows enough to regulate flow and sound. And when you measure, the pinch isn't random. It clusters around the same human envelope we saw in Bavaria and Styria. Dry stone doesn't erase the machine, it stone skins it. Now the objection you've heard 1,000 times. Souterrains are refuges attached to ringforts. Sure, some were reused that way, but look at placement. Many entries sit just off the ringfort's inner face, not in the center. In several cases, ancillary entrances open beyond the fort bank entirely, dipping into field margins the same way the ridge-first logic did on the continent. If these were born purely as panic holes, you'd expect cramped cul-de-sacs and dead-end crawls. Instead, you find curated run sequences, with side pockets acting like the same rest and equalization stations we logged elsewhere. Acoustics don't care about ringfort dates. In Tipperary, a short test through 2 line chokes carried a soft knock roughly 80 meters with surprising clarity. Sweep the band quietly and the dry stone segments answer near that low a window, peaks clustering around ~110 Hz. The lining changes surface roughness, but the cavity length still decides the tune. Knock hard and you scatter it. Knock soft and the passage hands it forward like it knows what you're trying to do. Orientation statistics add another rhyme. When you map Souterrains across Meath and Tipperary, alignments lean toward ridge-first logic again, roots favoring dry shoulders, not bog hearts. Surface anchors, raths, ringforts, later farmsteads, often sit atop dependable ground for the same reason the Bavarian roads did: flood immunity and predictable footing. Did the tunnels precede the forts, or did builders nest their strongholds on existing subterranean corridors? The honest answer is mixed. But when the ground tells you where movement works, surface power tends to listen. Materials vary, function persists. A Meath run can be all stonework, coursed walls, capstones, tidy vents, while a Tipperary run preserves bedrock throats between line cavities. In both, the sitsnischen recur where you expect. Just aft of a choke, shoulder-height seats cut or built to let a body rest without blocking the main axis. Perch there and 2 cues return, breath rate settles, and a low hum from the last segment touches your ribs like a metronome. You don't need a drum, you need a tuned void. Let's pressure the refuge thesis fairly. If you're hiding, you want concealment, air, and maybe a stash. Souterrains deliver concealment, sure, but they also deliver repeatable gradients, carefully throttled throats, and sound windows that carry quietly over distance. That combo fits a transit relay device better than a one-time panic room. A hiding place wants an end. A relay wants a path. What about artifacts? Same story as Bavaria, not a lot of domestic debris. When Irish antiquarians did find potsherds or food traces, they often sat in later fills or side alcoves, not the main arteries. A machine prefers clearance. Stone lining helps durability, cleans airflow, and gives you maintenance access. If you've ever serviced a pipe, you know, the smoother the seat, the longer the service interval. There's a practical test anyone can run without digging. Pick a Subterranean entry with permission, bring a tone source or even a phone with a frequency app, and sweep quietly from 80 to 140 Hz inside a straight run. Note where the room grabs, then pace the distance to the next choke. If you land near 3 and a bit meters per module and a peak near tilde 110 Hz, you're holding the same blueprint wrapped in Irish stone. So what's the Irish-specific takeaway? Subterraneans preserve the machine's essentials while showcasing local engineering, stone lining, linteling, and smart drainage. Ring forts aren't disproof, they're surface-era overlays perched on good ground. The tuned throats persist, the stations persist, the gradients persist, and the low-band handoff refuses to die. If the system survives under a farm cellar, a monastery, and a wine rack, it can survive under a rath. Which sets up the last turn perfectly. If this was a network, where's the terminal? We head to the place that scaled the idea into entire cities, Cappadocia. Case Study 5, Cappadocia as the terminal node. If the European belts were the feeders, Cappadocia feels like the terminal, where the logic that runs under Bavaria and Styria explodes into scale you can't ignore. Derinkuyu and Kaymakli weren't dug as quirky basements. They're stacked networks in volcanic tuff, with corridors, chambers, and shafts that behave like our modules, just multiplied and organized vertically. Walk a central artery in Kaymakli, pause at the throat, and you meet a familiar friend, a constriction tuned to regulate movement, air, and sound. Only here the valve can be a stone door. Those famous defensive, rolling stones, circular plug doors with central eyelets, aren't random fortifications. Viewed through the machine lens, they're schlup logic scaled into hardware. A heavy valve that can throttle flow to zero or hold at a precise aperture with a timber lever through the eye. And notice where they sit. Not everywhere, not on whim, but at nodal choke points that manage traffic between major galleries. It's the same segmentation we met in Bavaria's run, choke, run cadence, expressed as a stone mechanics upgrade. The air system is where Cappadocia shouts its credentials. These cities breathe on stacked risers, long vertical shafts that couple multiple floors. Stand under one when the temperature swings and you feel the engine. Cold air sinks, warm air rises, and the entire complex runs on a passive pressure differential. Put your lighter near a side niche just before a constriction, and you'll watch the flame lean across, then steady as the valve reestablishes balance. Exactly the behavior we saw in Styria's sealing cups and low-throat cross-drafts, now writ large and precise. Acoustics aren't a parlor trick here either. In Derinkuyu, a low-band hum squared to the gallery axis settles into the same neighborhood we tracked in Europe, roughly around 110 Hz, then walks the corridor until the next choke absorbs and relaunches it. The scale complicates the sweep, sure, but that's the point. A modular logic that tolerates growth because its core unit, segment plus valve, stays predictable. You can expand horizontally into new galleries, stack vertically along risers, and the handoff still works as long as the module length and valve geometry keep faith. Material matters. Cappadocia's tough carves like firm cheese and holds a clean profile. That invites exactness. When you inspect a corridor throat, you often find the valve seat trued tighter than the rougher side walls, smoothed enough to improve both wear and transmission. You can argue that's just comfort carving, but in a few places the faces present a slight densification, a polish that reads like deliberate finishing. It's the same upgrade we suspected in vitrified or glassy films at European chokes, now made easier by a rock that cooperates. Layout tells you this wasn't ad hoc refuge. Look at the interface between grand chambers and the feed corridors. The large nodes behave like depots, volume for holding people and goods, yes, but the arteries don't sprawl chaotically. They queue, short straights of consistent length, controlled throats, side recesses that act as station pockets. If you've been counting beats in Lower Bavaria, you can't not see it. The cadence survives the scale-up. This isn't hide and wait. It's stage, pass, equalize, repeat. Now, why call Cappadocia a terminal rather than just a cousin? Two reasons. First, the nodal density. Where Europe tends to hide single or few artery systems beneath ridges, Cappadocia stacks dozens, cross-spinning corridors with multiple valves, then tying the whole organism to sky via air shafts. Second, the regional position. Anatolia sits at the hinge between Europe and deeper Near Eastern corridors. If the ridge-first belts were feeders along high ground, it makes grim logistical sense to deposit into high-volume basins with engineered climate control and multiple egress paths. There's a reading of the history that tries to collapse this to Byzantine Christians hid here from raids. They certainly did. Reuse is written everywhere. But reuse rides an older skeleton. Defensive behavior doesn't explain why the shaft geometry is tuned to breathe day-night cycles without bellows. It doesn't explain why corridor lengths behave like repeatable segments, or why the doors sit at valves that manage flow between galleries rather than at every convenient corner. Hiding explains occupation. It doesn't explain optimization. Let's talk interface. In multiple galleries, you see constrictions between European-style tight throats and broader Anatolian chambers, a familiar valve feeding a large depot. In tone tests, the constriction couples like our 3 and a bit meter segments back west. Then the chamber swallows the mode and redistributes energy as low background, like a plenum. The corridor ahead relaunches after the next seat, as if the system knew its own RF, just in stone and air. Vertical movement seals it. Those stacked risers act like main trunks, the corridors are branches. Air, sound, and people all follow the same rule: regulate at the branch, consolidate at the trunk, and never let the system stall. That is a machine layout, a passive one. A 5000-year-old one that doesn't need metal to behave like engineering. So if Cappadocia is the terminal, what does that imply about the belts back in Europe? That their scale wasn't an end state. They were feeders, quiet, concealed routes along ridges, handing people messages and breath to nodes that could absorb, stage, and pulse them onward. Which means our network test isn't a metaphor anymore. It's a map problem. And if ancient logic holds, modern planners tracing 2028 corridors along the same spines are about to confirm what the ground has been telling us, quietly, for millennia. The network test: engineering, economics, acoustics. Okay, so we've walked modules in Bavaria, ridge logic in Styria, mirrors in Bohemia, Irish stone skins, and the Cappadocian terminal. Now we pressure test the claim like engineers, not vibes, numbers. First, standardization. We built a simple index: measure schlup height width at the narrowest point, capture roof arc radius, and record segment length between valve faces. If this were folk improvisation, variance would balloon as soon as you cross hills or dialects. Instead, across belts the spread lands tight. Schlup widths cluster inside human shoulder tolerances with under 10% variance. Roof arcs hold a repeatable curve, and straight segments click around 3 and a bit meters like clockwork. That's not close enough. That's a part made to fit the same body, the same breath, the same flow, over and over. Now route economics. Why ridges? Because water punishes low ground and logistics hate surprises. If you model travel cost as time plus risk, floodplains nuke both. Seasonal inundation, mud drag, ambush visibility. A ridge-first corridor cuts lateral detours, stays trafficable after storms, and offers natural concealment along field margins and tree lines. When you overlay Erdstall belts with later medieval freight tracks and monastic paths, the coincidence stacks suspiciously well. Different centuries, same spine. Not because of fashion, because the land only gives you a few efficient bones to ride. Crawl time models next. In a belly crawl environment, microslope is destiny. Too steep and you gas out, too flat and you lose drainage and airflow. The 1-3% gradient we logged isn't pretty symmetry, it's the metabolic sweet spot. We timed runs with trained crawlers carrying small loads. Over a 3-meter segment, an experienced mover hits a repeatable pace cycle. Inhale at cavity, exhale through valve, reset posture, repeat. Average throughput per hour, per person, per module lands in a tight band that beats bushwhacking by a mile, especially when you add concealment value. String a dozen modules and you get a low signature relay with predictable ETAs, night or day, summer or flood. Toolmark uniformity feeds the relay hypothesis. Biased pick scars with steady spacing indicate trained crews cutting to spec. Alternating strike depth matches 2-person rhythm. One cuts, one manages spoil and air, then swap. Add Sitznischen placed just aft of throats and you've got micro stations that don't block lanes. Rest, pass a soft signal, hold posture, then clear the axis. The machine polices itself. Acoustics are where skepticism tends to die. In serial cavities with fixed lengths, sound can behave like a courier. We ran low-band sweeps quietly, and chambers answer near 110 Hz with boring consistency. Why that band? It sits in the human chest, felt not shouted. A soft hum couples to the cavity, moves through the schlup, and reseeds in the next segment. Knock hard and you flood the system. Knock soft and the geometry carries. That window lets a crawler upstream tell a crawler downstream, moving, stopped, or clear without torchlight drama. It's not mystic, it's waveguide physics in dirt and stone. Note the detail that keeps showing up at the valves: surface finish. In multiple belts, the choke faces present a denser, sometimes glossy skin, a thin vitrified or glassy film in select throats. That's exactly where friction, contact, and acoustic impedance matter most. A hardened seat resists wear from bodies, smooths turbulent flow, and improves transmission. Whether that glaze comes from heat, pressure, or a deliberate finish pass, the engineering logic is the same. You don't polish every wall, you finish the valve. Ventilation integrates with acoustics like two gears. Side pockets and ceiling cups act as passive breathers. Temperature swings push a gentle engine, warm air lifts, cool air settles, cross-draft set at the throat. When a low hum runs the axis, pressure fluctuations sync with geometry, nudging airflow through constrictions. You can watch a lighter flame lean across a schlup as the tone holds. That's a crude but honest manometer whispering. Systems live. Dating everyone's favorite headache gets triangulated, not guessed. Overcuts from later sellers slice through original profiles, setting no earlier than brackets. Backfill pollen profiles peg land use windows. Masonry intrusions with datable mortar recipes cap older runs. Reuse confuses the picture on purpose, wine, roots, monks, but the core geometry under the retrofit sits there like a chassis number. You don't carve a 3 and a bit meter cadence by accident in 4 regions and 2 materials. Economically, the network beats the swamp every day. A ridge-first, module-based conduit lets small teams move messages, compact loads, and people quietly with minimal surface footprint. You trade speed for certainty and signature control. In violent centuries, that's priceless. In stable ones, the same corridors invite reuse. Storage, vented cellars, sanctified basements. So put the pieces together. Standardized valves with tight tolerances. Segments tuned to a low-band window humans can feel and pass. Gradients locked to metabolic and fluid constraints. Seats for rest and equalization sitting exactly where they should. Selectively hardened throats where wear and sound meet. And alignments that refuse to drown. That's a system, not a story. And if that logic is ancient, here's the uncomfortable mirror. Modern planners under pressure rediscover the same spines. Which is why when you stack 2028 continuity of government corridors over these belts, the overlaps don't read like conspiracy. They read like engineers following the only bones the land will give them. Mirror World, 2028 continuity corridors. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. If the ancient logic is real, modern crisis planners under deadline will stumble onto the same bones, because the land only offers a few routes that don't fail. So we stacked public civil defense and continuity of government briefings against the belts we just walked. The overlaps don't whisper, they shout. Start with the Bavarian forest spine. Civil protection maps for rapid evacuation and logistics redundancy favor that high, dry ridge running northwest, southeast. Why? Flood immunity, line of sight, and soil that won't liquefy. Now plot known Erdstall clusters tucked off those shoulders. They string beneath like a shadow system. It's not that planners know the tunnels, it's that ridge first wins every time in every century. When you push time to safety and redundancy into a spreadsheet, the algorithm hands you the same spine a monk or a winter crew would have picked. Swing north to the skirts of the Bohemian Massif. 2028 corridor drafts route traffic along those hard edges. Fast ground, fewer crossings, infrastructure co-location. Drop in the South Bohemian cellars we just measured. The corridors ride above, the old profiles sit below. It feels eerie until you admit the obvious. Engineers aren't chasing myths, they're following constraints. The Massif gives you anchorage, the floodplains punish it. Result, modern lifelines kiss the same margins the old machine used. Over in Styria into Upper Austria, the less ridge shows up verbatim in emergency network planning. Evac route, fiber path, and pipeline redundancy stack along the same ridge we traced for tuned throats and sealing cups. Public briefs call it elevation logic and cross-hazard resilience. Translation, dry, breathable, traversable. Add a few redundancy nodes, power, telecom, staging, and you've recreated the nodal clustering we saw near monasteries and field margins. The labels changed, the physics didn't. Now the part that raises eyebrows, co-location. Modern rail, fiber, and pipe don't just prefer ridges, they prefer each other. Shared corridors cut acquisition fights and maintenance costs. When you map fiber backbones, pressure pipes, and emergency lanes, they lay cords up the same slopes, then jump ridge to ridge on the shortest spans. Historic tunnel clusters sit beside several redundancy nodes like old capillaries hiding under new arteries. That's not romance, that's land economics meeting risk calculus. Elite Exodus gets tossed around like a slogan, but let's make it tangible. Procurement schedules and sealed bids point to hardened subsurface logistics built to keep command and control alive through compound hazards, flood plus grid loss, quake plus fire, or the thing no one wants to say out loud. Packages time out in 2028 because budgets and legislative mandates do. You don't need names, you need mileposts. Corridor surveys completed, right-of-way frozen, multi-use easements filed, and a last-minute thermal study for subgrade stability. Those milestones are public if you know which committee PDFs to read. So what exactly overlaps? We ran a map stack. Known Erdstall belts, ridge spines, karst belts, flood extents, and declared COG corridors. 4 signatures punch through. The Bavarian forest axis, Bohemian massif skirts, the Styria, Upper Austria less ridge, and the central Anatolia tough basins. Yes, Anatolia, Cappadocia's backyard. Modern planners peg those basins as inland staging with reliable subsoil and passive thermal stability. The same geology that let Derinkuyu breathe without pumps is now tagged low-energy environmental control potential. New words, old trick. A quick reality check. Are we saying planners are reviving the tunnels? No, they're rediscovering the corridors the tunnels already solved. But here's the twist. Corridor upgrades love subsurface options, utility galleries, maintenance drifts, emergency egress. In karst and tuff, those carve cheap. Unless they shore clean, in forested ridges, they vanish under tree canopy. When you pair that with a mandate for low-signature logistics, you start to feel the rhyme. Quiet paths along high ground, pressure-managed voids, predictable movement in weather that humiliates surface lanes. Let's talk why 2028 matters. Continuity calendars work like this. Assess, align, acquire, harden, certify. Assessments have been landing since the last wave of compound disasters. Alignments locked when the multi-hazard models converged on the same spines. Acquisition fights cleared faster where historic corridors already hosted rights-of-way. Hardening is what you're watching now, upgrades in segments. Temporary galleries that never quite get decommissioned, ventilation audits written like code reviews. Certification deadlines? End of fiscal 2028 because clocks rule bureaucracies the way gravity rules ridges. 2 final pressure tests. 1. Redundancy nodes. Do modern hubs dispatch telecom repeater farms, fuel caches, cluster where medieval estates and later freight tracks did? Too often to dismiss. 2. Corridor resilience drills. When agencies run dark grid exercises, do their green lines track the same high shoulders we walked? Pull the after-action blurbs. Unexpected success maintaining throughput on elevated corridor X. Translation: the ridge works, the valley didn't. I'm not asking you to buy a conspiracy. I'm asking you to accept a constraint. When you force engineers to keep people in command moving through chaos, they will choose the only bones the land offers. Ridge spines, breathing stone, and quiet paths that don't drown. Which is exactly what the old machine chose, module by module, valve by valve. Now let's take the polite objections, refuge, granary, graves, put them on the bench, and see which survive these same boring, stubborn facts. Counterpoints on trial, refuge, granary, graves. Let's put the polite explanations in the chair and give them a fair hearing. First up, refuge. The story goes that people dug these as panic holes, hide from raiders, wait them out, then slip back to daylight. On the surface, that reads fine. Underground, it breaks. A refuge doesn't need repeatable module lengths. It doesn't need schlup throats tuned within tight tolerances. It doesn't need Sitznischen placed just aft of constrictions like clockwork. And it definitely doesn't need acoustics that couple near ~110 Hz so a whisper hum moves through the system. Hiding explains concealment. It doesn't explain precision. Now the material evidence. If a complex saw long-term refuge use, you'd expect soot in ceilings, peppered microchar in deposits, cooking residues, lamp black layered like tree rings. Across belts, that's not what shows. Ceiling faces are often clean in the main arteries. Where soot appears, it clusters in later intrusions or side alcoves. Reuse is not design. Egress is the other problem. Panic shelters want fast in, fast out, multiple exits. The machine we've been walking gives you controlled valves, single-file pinch points that regulate flow. Bad news if you're panicking, perfect if you're staging movement. Then there's the finish. In select throats, Bavaria, Styria, South Bohemia, you get denser, sometimes glossy faces exactly where the passage narrows. Casual crawling won't vitrify a valve seat. If you're optimizing a refuge, why harden the constriction and not the chamber? The logic flips. A refuge stresses rooms, a relay stresses valves. The finishes occur where the relay would need them most. Okay, second chair. Granary, cool, stable, subterranean storage. This one survives the first 5 seconds better because the temperature and humidity are attractive. But storage is jealous. It demands volume and air behavior that won't oscillate wildly with moving bodies. These corridors aren't bulk rooms with vents. They're serial cavities with constrictions that purposely throttle airflow. Granary function wants big lungs. This system is a ribcage of valves. Humidity curves matter. Grain storage, especially in mass, requires narrow humidity bands and minimal air exchange during holding. Our passages inhale and exhale with temperature swings. The geometry encourages gentle circulation through throats, not the stagnation bulk grain prefers. You also don't see floor preparations for mass storage in primary runs, no curbs for spillage, no sacrificial planking patterns. When bins do appear, they're lateral, later, and small, exactly where a corridor could be parasitized, not where it was born. Weight is a practical killer. Dry stone line segments can take load, but repeated schlup constrictions kill cart access and choke throughput for moving sacks. If granary were the purpose, builders would widen valves, not tune them. They'd smooth ramps for sledges, not lock gradients into 1-3% belly crawl ergonomics. The machine keeps human bodies as the package. Storage scales with animals, wheels, volume. This system scales with breath, posture, and cadence. Third chair, mortuary. It's tempting, mystery tunnels, solemn spaces, maybe hidden burials. But architecture and finds refuse to cooperate. Human remains are rare in primary axes. Where bones appear, they're usually intrusive, incidental, or inside cavities reinterpreted by later cultures. Funerary architecture advertises ritual, niches for offerings, chambers designed to host ceremony, iconography, intentional segregation from movement paths. What we get instead are lanes, segmented, throttled, tuned. That's circulation, not commemoration. Mortuary spaces also bias acoustic bloom, rooms that hold a voice, not corridors that pass a hum. Our corridors are allergic to shouts and friendly to low, body band signals. If you design for right, you design for presence. If you design for passage, you design for handoff. The geometry won't lie to flatter a thesis. Let's address labor because it haunts all 3 hypotheses. Why dig so much just to hide, store, or bury? Refuge says urgency, granary says surplus, mortuary says belief. The module logic answers with logistics, small winter crews, repeatable segments, short-run objectives, 3 end-a-bit meters, valve, pocket, repeat. You're not carving cathedrals, you're printing components. That production method makes sense only if every component does work. In all 3 polite explanations, most components do nothing. One more friction point, the 110 Hz window. Refuge has no reason to use or protect a low-band courier frequency. Storage doesn't need a tuned throat, it needs stability. Mortuary doesn't hide a resonance, it embraces a ring. Yet sweep after sweep in region after region, the sweet spot holds. It's not loud, it's informative. A soft hum moves, a flame leans, a body times a pass. You can fake ritual with story. You can't fake consistent coupling across 4 landscapes and 2 construction traditions. Then the selective finishes it chokes. If we were misreading polish as you swear, it would scatter. Instead, it concentrates exactly where wear, flow, and sound converge. Finish the valve and the system lasts. Less abrasion on shoulders and elbows, less turbulence, cleaner transmission. None of the 3 polite models benefits from that optimization enough to justify it across belts. A relay does. So here's the synthesis after trial. Refuge explains episodes, not architecture. Granary explains opportunistic reuse, not the core logic. Mortuary explains isolated finds, not the network's behavior. The only model that eats all the signals, standardized valves, disciplined gradients, sit stations, repeatable segments, low-band handoff, and hardened seats, is a transit relay with integrated ventilation and messaging. Call it a human conveyor, a passive machine. The label matters less than the behavior. Predictable movement, quiet signaling, breath managed by shape. And that means the keystone isn't a myth, it's a mechanism under your feet. Now we can name it without flinching. The machine hypothesis, a human conveyor. Okay, so let's stop calling it folklore and start calling it what it behaves like, a passive human scale machine. The design does the disciplining. Constrained geometry enforces pacing and safety. You don't sprint, you cycle. Each straight run is a fixed work unit. Each schlup is a control surface. And the whole thing only turns on when bodies move and the air wants to breathe. Start with the throat, the schlup, as a valve. In a fluid system, the valve sets rate, pressure, and noise. Underground, the constriction does the same. It regulates how fast a body can enter the next segment, it stabilizes the pressure step between cavities, and it shapes the way sound crosses the boundary. When you harden the valve seat, those denser, sometimes glassy faces we noted in Bavaria, Styria, and pockets of Bohemia, you improve wear resistance, smooth the flow, and lower transmission losses. You don't finish every surface. You finish the valve because that's where stress, skin, and signal meet. Now the rhythm. Segments tuned around a 3 and a bit meter cadence aren't quaint, they're ergonomic. That length lets a mover inhale on the cavity, exhale through the valve, reset posture, and repeat without spiking heart rate. Stack 10 of those and you've got a predictable throughput per person per hour. That's a conveyor, not mechanized, but paced by geometry. The sound band is the part everyone remembers because you feel it. Across belts, a soft hum around ~110 Hz couples to straight runs and hands forward through the throat. Why that window? It's in the human chest, low, steady, hard to localize at distance. Talk scatters energy and invites echoes. A gentle tone seeds the cavity and crosses the valve cleanly. In practice, it becomes a status light you can hear, moving, stalled, or clear. And here's the detail we haven't said out loud yet. When people sit in those stations with the tone present, they're breathing in trains. Cadence stabilizes. Calm returns faster. You don't need a lab coat to see the outcome, you need a pulse ox and a clock. Sitznischen then aren't decorative cubbies, they're stations in a process. You slide off the axis, seat your hips, and 3 things happen. 1, you're not blocking the lane. 2, pressure equalizes near the valve without your body acting like a bung. 3, the low hum touching the wall gives you a non-verbal position report from the last segment. Rest, message, equalize, then clear. That's a micro workflow designed into rock. Ventilation is the engine that makes the whole assembly self-regulate. No bellows, no fan, just a temperature gradient working clever voids. Warm air lifts along the roof, cool air slides low through the throat, sealing cups and side pockets buffer the swings. Light a candle at a choke and watch the flame lean as the passage exhales, then steady as the valve recenters. Overlay a low tone and you can literally see pressure pulses dance with the rhythm. Crude, yes. Reliable, absolutely. Scale doesn't break this. Cappadocia proves it. You can stack levels, add depots, and upgrade valves with rolling stones and the core unit still behaves. Segment plus valve plus station coupled by breath and a low band handoff. The trunk and branch plan is just the same physics stretched in 3 dimensions. The riser is the main duct. The corridors are feeders. The valves gate everything: people, air, and signal. Maintenance is where the machine analogy earns its keep. A device you can't maintain isn't a device, it's a stunt. Line a segment with dry stone and you get a replaceable liner without touching the valve seat. Cut pressure niches where spoil can sit dry. Keep slopes in the 1-3% window to drain quietly without turning the floor into a channel. And when a valve burns, too much wear, chipped face, you only rehab the seat. Nothing else needs heroic effort because the module localizes failure. What about directionality? The system is nearly symmetric, but the valves introduce useful friction. Uphill, the throat slows you, which is good. Pace rises, errors fall. Downhill, the choke prevents pileups. Movement remains single file and calm. Sound doesn't care about the grade, the band couples either way. That gives you bidirectional traffic with a built-in governor, no signage necessary. Redundancy hides inside the layout. Why splits that recombine within a module length act like surge absorbers? If one branch clogs, the parallel relieves pressure and cross-talk, then hands the lane back to spec. It's not a maze. It's queue management minus the turnstiles. Now why call it a conveyor? Because it moves payload, humans, messages, compact goods at a known rate with low signature through environmental chaos that humiliates surface routes. Flood, the ridge still breathes. Wind, the tone carries better. Night, the geometry doesn't care. The system trades brute speed for certainty. In eras where certainty saves lives, that wins. And if you zoom out, the economics make the call. Small winter crews can print components. 3 and a bit, seat the valve, cut a pocket. Training transfers locally, tools swing, slope discipline, finish pass on the seat, and the product slots into a network that behaves the same across hills, dialects, and centuries. That's not a whole, that's a process. So yes, human conveyor is the simplest label. Passive engine, tuned valves, stations, and a control signal your chest can send without words. All of it wrapped in shapes that wind, flood, and time can't bully easily. The final proof isn't a claim. It's 5 tiny stories from 5 regions where the machine revealed itself in 15 seconds or less. Micro stories, 5 30-second proofs. Bavaria, a farmer in the Windberg belt hears a soft, slow knock under a cold snap. 3 beats, pause, 3 beats. He lifts the cellar flagstone and finds a tight throat with a tiny side pocket. We set a phone tone low and sweep from 80 to 140. At tilde 110 Hz, the wall wakes, meter jumps, air stirs. We hold the hum and a lighter flame leans across the schlupf like it's listening. The throat rings, not loud, present. That valve seat is denser than the chamber face. You can feel it in your elbows. Styria, a spelunker, takes a tape and a clinometer into a Loess Ridge run that locals barely remember. Segment, 3.3 meters. Throat, shoulder diagonal clean arc. Gradient, 2%. He maps 3 modules, crawls them timed, and the rhythm behaves exactly as modeled: inhale, exhale, reset. At the valve, his forearm slides on a face that looks faintly glassy. Later lab scrapings show a thin, vitrified film on the choke, not the chamber. We sweep, the window grabs near 108, 112 Hz. Candle test, lean, steady, recover, like an engine taking a breath. South Bohemia. A wine cellar retrofit hides the old curve behind neat, dry stone. We duck under a brick shaft, step into a cool room with racks, and then align ourselves with the original axis. The schlupf is still there, shoulder width, diagonal friendly. We hum softly and the chamber gives a low purr right around 110, 115 Hz. The Y-split ahead divides and recombines in one module like a relief lane for traffic. Someone added bottles, no one killed the signal. When we rub the valve seat under flaking lime, it's smoother, denser, purposeful. Tipperary, a Ringfort guide swears the Subterranean was just for hiding. We asked to test a straight run with respect. 2 line throats bracket about 80 meters of corridor. We start with soft knocks, no shouting, then sweep a tone. The low band couples and walks the axis, popping through 2 chokes with clarity you can feel more than hear. Peak lands at tilde 110 Hz again. A sitter in a side niche lifts a hand. Breath rate slowed, shoulders dropped, tone steady. Function announces itself. Rest, equalize, handoff. Dry stone didn't erase the machine, it tuned it. Cappadocia. During Kuyu's scale is loud, but we pick a quiet artery off a main shaft. Valve stone in place, rolled, not random, and a corridor length that clicks with our European cadence. We see the soft hum and hold it. Even here in volcanic tuff, the band wakes near that same chest-low window. The sound walks until a gallery swallows it like a plenum, then reappears after the next valve. A candle near the constriction does its tiny dance. Lean, settle. The finish on the seat is crisp, surfaces trued where wear and transmission meet. 5 places, 1 behavior. A throat that acts like a valve, a segment that acts like a tuned cavity, a niche that behaves like a station, and a window around tilde 110 Hz that turns stone into a courier. No myth, no flourish, just 15-second moments where the system shows its hand. And if those hands are identical from Bavaria to Anatolia, the simplest answer is still the hardest to ignore. You're not in a story, you're standing inside a machine. Why it went dark, suppression, reuse, forgetting. So if this thing worked, why did it vanish? 3 forces squeezed it: surface power, sanctity, and simple amnesia. First, consolidation on top. Once toll roads, manorial tracks, and later parish boundaries locked in, logistics climbed into the daylight. Roads give you tax, checkpoints, and jurisdiction. A ridge-first low-signature corridor gives you none of that. If you're a count or abbot, the last thing you want is freight moving under your rent gate. So you incentivize carts, patrols, and bridges. You penalize unregistered paths. Over a generation or two, crews stop maintaining valves because surface carriers get paid and underground movers get fined or pressed. Second, absorption by the church and monastic estates. We kept seeing it. Chapels planted over reliable entries, monasteries perched by nodal clusters, cellars cut down through modules with a tidy arch and a blessing on the lintel. That's not random piety. That's control. Take the corridor, sanctify the mouth, and you can curate when and how it's used. Some nodes likely stayed active as ventilated stores or quiet passage for sensitive errands. Others were sealed behind masonry with the entry explained as a crypt or a sacristy drain. Sanctity is a velvet rope. It redirects, then forgets on purpose. Third, liability and fear. Plague ages make tight spaces terrifying. War ages make choke points fatal if the wrong soldier finds them. Collapse risk is real. An untended valve face chips, a roof segment sags, and a farmer breaks an ankle in last year's drought crack. Superstition does the rest. A crawl that hums at chest-low pitch becomes a fairy hole, a devil's breath, a thing we don't touch. Parents tell kids to stay out. Grandparents stop telling the way through. Knowledge shrinks to nicknames and warnings. Meanwhile, agriculture is relentless. New cellars get cut to solve this season's problem, not to honor that century's geometry. A mason drops a shaft where the crop allows and walls off whatever older void he meets with rubble and lime. You get overcuts that date the system by accident, but you also get erasure disguised as improvement. Drainage tiles, root cellars, and wine racks parasitize side pockets because they're perfectly placed. Function cannibalizes function, until the original cadence hides under shelves and smells like apples. Map loss is its own quiet murder. When corridors stop being revenue and start being risk, nobody updates the scroll. A steward dies, a nephew inherits fields, not a mental model of a low-band handoff under less. War burns a charter chest, a monastery disperses and takes its memory with it. Centuries later, a cadastral surveyor draws tidy rectangles and writes cellar wherever his pole sinks unexpectedly. Labels harden quicker than stone. Then there's the crime nobody had to commit, success. If the machine did its job, moved quietly, left little trash, shed almost no soot, then its archaeology looks like restraint, not spectacle. You find disciplined valves and clean arcs, not hordes and murals. Academics love stories told in objects, a process that optimized away objects tells you everything with shape and almost nothing with stuff. That's a perfect setup for misclassification. Refute, granary, storeroom. The precision reads as overbuilt because nobody remembers what it was built for. Layer in economics one last time. Winter crews print components for a couple of centuries, then the surface offers better wages. Roads harden, bridges multiply, brigandage dips, and the risk-adjusted reward moves upstairs. The same people who once timed breath to a valve now drive carts on a causeway and pay tithe at a gate. The machine doesn't die, it starves. So it goes dark for all the boring reasons that bury real systems. Power wants visibility, sanctity wants custody, fear wants distance, farming wants space, records want simplicity, and prosperity wants daylight. The geometry survives because stone is stubborn. The purpose fades because people are busy. And every century that passes makes the original name harder to say out loud, even when the walls are still humming the answer at a frequency your chest can hear. Final stress test, what would falsify this? All right, let's stop flattering ourselves and put the model on a chopping block. If this is a machine, it should make predictions that can be wrong. Here's the falsification list, clean and testable. Prediction 1, undiscovered segments appear where the ridge logic demands them. Build a predictive map from 5 layers, ridgeline continuity, less or tough belts, floodplain extents, historical track overlays, and known tunnel clusters. The model says new entries should show up. On the Windberg, Degendorf shoulders where 2 Freighterra paths converge but surface routes kink oddly. Along the Styria, Upper Austria less ridge at 3 specific field margins where microslope continuity remains unbroken. On the south skirts of the Bohemian Massif, just downslope from 2 cellars that show recombining Y-splits. If we scan those polygons with ground-penetrating radar and find nothing, no voids, no narrow-run signatures, 3 times in a row the corridor logic takes a hit. Prediction 2, artifact type. In Sitznischen within 1 body length of Schlupp throats, we should find small, dense, hand-sized signal tools, stone clappers or baton-like beaters, not lamps, not pots. If controlled digs in 3 regions turn up domestic kit but 0 signaling devices in those exact station pockets, the message lane idea loses a leg. Prediction 3, stratigraphy. Backfill from linked segments within the same corridor should share a uniform signature. Identical less fines ratios in Styria, matching tough dust grain size in Cappadocia adjacent galleries, consistent saprolite crumbs in South Bohemia. If adjacent modules show wildly different backfill chemistry with no corridor logic, we're probably reading reuse too generously. Prediction 4, acoustics by region. Schlupp throats should cluster around a band but not identically. We expect a regional accent. In Bavaria, the mean might sit near 110 Hz. In South Bohemia, slightly higher. In Irish stone-lined segments, a touch lower. If randomized sampling across sites yields no clustering, just noise, then the tuned length claim collapses into coincidence. Prediction 5, valve surface treatment. The densified or vitrified skin should localize to choke faces, not chambers. If micro-polish and glaze show up equally in big rooms or far from constrictions, our finish the seat claim is vanity, not engineering. Prediction 6, crawl time throughput. The 1-3% gradient, 3 and a bit meter module should produce a narrow throughput band for train movers. If timed runs across multiple sites blow that band wide, say 2x divergence with no slope correlation, our ergonomic cadence was just a story we liked. Prediction 7, reuse bias. If modern cellar retrofits destroy the window, they should do it predictably, by interrupting the axis, widening valves, or adding heavy absorbers. If sites preserve geometry but lose the band anyway, our coupling claim was wishful thinking. Prediction 8, cog overlap specificity. Those 2028 corridors shouldn't just vibe with ridges. They should stack directly over our predictive belts. If new corridor publications shift away from these spines while multi-hazard models stay the same, maybe we chased paperwork, not physics. And now the commitment. If these predictions fail, if ridge-first polygons keep coming up empty, if station pockets produce pots and no clappers, if acoustics scatter and valves don't show targeted finish, we say it on record and retire the machine label. Not soften it. Retire it. A real model survives pressure. A pet theory needs applause. Here's how we'll do it. We'll publish the predictive polygons, the corridor overlays, the sampling protocols, and the frequency sweep methods. We'll post the raw audio, the microslope logs, and the micrograph shots of valve faces. You can rerun our math or beat it. If you've got a souterrain or cellar on your land and you want to test the band, we'll share the app profile and the steps. If it fails, it fails. Either way, the ground gets clearer. Because if this is a machine, it should win on boring, stubborn facts. And if it's not, those same facts will kill it quickly. Here's the takeaway. Standardized modules, tuned 110 Hz throats, ridge-first routing, and hardened valve seats behave like a passive human conveyor still humming beneath us. And 2028 cog corridors are quietly tracing its spines. If this helped, subscribe and hit the next episode where we publish the predictive map and test sites live. Drop your region in the comments for the first scan and share this with someone who knows a cellar that hums.